I'd love to get like super deeply technical, and love to always answer some of those questions. But we're going to talk about sort of general why OpenStack is important, and how to introduce it into yourself, into your organization. And I'm happy if we never even make it through the entire slide deck. I'm all good with that, because it's more important that you get information out of here. So just pop up your hand, ask questions anytime, and I'm always happy to do this. Because what's funny is I'm going to talk a little bit later, at one of the roundtables about containers and OpenStack. So I'm sure in a year they're going to be like, hey, you're the container guy that used to talk about OpenStack, that used to talk about VMware. But what's really fun is we're at a VMware user group and we're talking about OpenStack. That's pretty cool. So again, I'm a blogger, a cloud pundit. I always like to say that. There is actually @CloudPundit. That's Lydia Leong. She works for Gartner. She's actually a great read. Super nice and very smart lady. And she looks at all cloud stuff across the industry. I work for VMTurbo as the technology evangelist and principal solutions engineer. And again, if you want to reach out to me on Disco Posse on Twitter, on LinkedIn, just trust me, search for Disco Posse on Twitter. On LinkedIn, there's only one. I do a lot of work with vMug, with the V Brown Bag as well. We did a Couch to OpenStack series, which is kind of fun. I also did a course on Pluralsight called Introduction to OpenStack, which I'm remiss in updating, because this is actually referring to now 3 editions ago of OpenStack. Unfortunately, business is good and hasn't allowed me to go back and update all of my content. But again, as time has gone on, I did the course over a year ago, and it's gotten larger uptake in the last month than previously, because there's been a lot more people who have come to realize, like, this OpenStack is very, very important. Now, you'll pardon me, because I do use some North American references, but I do know that you've probably seen Fool Us and a few other events here. Anybody know who these fine gentlemen are? All right, okay, so this is Penn and Teller. Penn and Teller are magicians. They are tricksters. They're very proud that magic doesn't exist, but they will trick you. They're very good at it. What's more important, and why I use them when I talk about what we're doing, is they do something very interesting. They do one of their tricks, they do a few of them this way, where they actually show you exactly how they do it. They effectively open source their trick. They'll walk you through precisely what all these little things that go into the box, and they uncover it, and they show you where it's at, and Teller's hiding and doing all these things, and they do this whole process, and they tell you exactly how it works, but then in the end, they redo the trick without opening all the doors and doing all the things, and it goes by in seconds, and it actually just works, and it's really interesting. And it's funny, and I think to myself, well, why is it that they can tell you exactly how they do this, but yet it's still fun to watch? Right? And this kind of reminded me of the way that we look at like open sourcing. We've got a lot of folks that really dive in where we can see how the bits work, but in the end, it doesn't take away from the importance of the trick and the product itself. So it's neat that you kind of get to see both sides. OpenStack is interesting in that way because you can literally see through the code, but that doesn't mean you need to be able to code in Python to use it. There's a lot of different ways to consume OpenStack. Open source in general is very important to me and to a lot of us in the industry. It's interesting, though, because there's kind of an advocacy that goes along with it. It's the same as any other sort of political organization, unfortunately, that there are true, fully open advocates, and it can seem a little overwhelming when you talk with some of them, because they kind of tell you that whatever you've done up to now has been wrong. That because you're not open sourcing everything you do, it's a challenge. What I do like is that it is changing the way that we consume things. Open source products are out there all over, and it gives us a chance to acquire software, not necessarily have to pay for it. But this is the fun part. Open is not free. While you can download OpenStack and deploy it freely, I say it's like free hypervisors and free software. It's like free kittens. They're only free at the start, and they get really complainy if you don't feed them. So you do have to pay for stuff in maintaining them. So that's one of the challenges that people get when they think about OpenStack, and it's like, oh, I'm going to be able to run it for free. It's also not perfect. I love a lot of open source people, and they're very, very good people, but at the same time, even commercial products are not perfect. So we have to watch that there's not a blind acceptance that because it's open, that it's inherently better than any other product. So it's tough. Like, I never like to downplay how important it is, but it is important that we see both sides. But again, it is fundamentally good. Open sourcing products has proven out to increase the innovation levels. Take a look at, there we go. Take a look what's gone on. VMware just opened up their Photon controller for their Photon containers platform and for their Photon environment. Why did they do that? Because they cannot keep up with the pace of innovation by keeping it inside their development shop, period. How are they going to open source a product and still sell it to you? Easy, because they're going to layer stuff on top of it that's going to make it easier to consume. But the core fundamentals, they're going to open it up till it means that community can derive what they need out of it, they can feed back into it and build it as they want. Because the walled gardens approach, has not proven out to be as good at innovation in some of these areas. So, has anybody ever know what movie this is from? All right. So you know what happens when he's in this scene? He goes, what's in the box? I worked in a data center for years, and every single time someone would bring some product in or they would bring in some appliance, and the first thing I would say is, what's in the box? I need to know what's inside it. As security advocates, as systems administrators, as consumers of technology, it's important for us to know what's inside the box. That's why it's a very, very nice shift to see in how OpenStack, open source tools are available. We can see everything that's running inside it. We're not the only ones. You don't have to go to a VMware or as an example, they would pick a product, they would deliver it to you, and you'd always say like, what does it need to be able to communicate? What ports do I need to open? And they would carefully tell you what it is. Microsoft was famous for this. They're like, they would have it fully open, and you'd have to go and lock it all backwards. It's different, because we now have access to every single working bit that's inside the box. That's what's cool about open. So why is it that we should be fearing open source? Because all these, traditional, closed source advocates would always tell you that you've got to be careful. And I thought, if open source is so good, why is it that people are still afraid? There's no reason, there's no possible way that open source can be bad, right? Oh, right. So we remember a little thing called Heartbleed that happened. So it was probably almost a year ago now. And the problem that happened with Heartbleed was it opened up this idea that OpenSSH was vulnerable. And we thought, all the people that were big fans of closed source are like, that'll teach you open source hippies to use open source products because you're insecure. So what's going to happen is there's going to be somebody who's going to be wearing a balaclava on a laptop inside your data center, and they're figuring out stuff. I know a lot of white hat hackers. They do not wear balaclavas. I mean, the data centers can be cold sometimes, but they usually do it from a hotel room, not from the data center. So what was cool is we thought, thank goodness I run a good closed source, commercially supported product that's not vulnerable to the Heartbleed. And then all of a sudden I started to get emails from a few of my partner vendors saying, hey, guess what? You need to update the software on your products because they're susceptible to the Heartbleed vulnerability. And I said, well, wait a minute. Why is it that if I've been told that I'm not supposed to use open source, that I'm being sold a product that's run on open source technology? The truth is you've been running open source the entire time and you never even realized it. So why wouldn't we just go in and make it happen ourselves? And that's why OpenStack's interesting and important. OpenStack's important because it tells a new story. It's talking about challenges that we have, being able to consume technology in a different way, being able to take the private cloud and make it reality. Now, the public cloud advocates don't like it either, because the public cloud folks think that's the only way to go. It should be infinitely scalable, should be all these neat things. Well, the reality is you've got probably regulatory reasons why you need to keep stuff in your data center. That's a big thing. I work in Canada in financial services, and that was a big issue for us. We couldn't put stuff out in Amazon. We couldn't do things. We take a look at what's gone on with a lot of private cloud companies, in the EU and in the region. They are getting great success because they're recognizing the limitations with going to the public cloud for stuff. We've got to really go to look at Canopy Cloud. So Ricky's here, and Ricky's doing a session later on, and you should definitely listen to anything he does because he's a wicked cool guy, and they do some neat stuff. They recognized early that being able to embrace cloud and enable it for companies was important. So let's kind of do this. So the OpenStack community is getting better at this. The reason why we have to get better is because in 5 years, we're going to look back on a moment just like we look back on this one. This is a famous quote from Bill Gates that 640K ought to be enough. What's more interesting is it's a famous quote that he never actually said, but the context of it was true, that at the time, it was all that mattered, right? There was a limitation on what hardware could consume as far as the way that it could use physical memory, and this made sense. So companies latched onto this idea, but that was the time. So here we are, we're being told that OpenStack's not ready, but the trick is, I keep hearing that over and over again, but it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. And the question is not, is OpenStack ready, but are you ready to be able to consume OpenStack and use it? So at VMTurbo, we actually ran a survey, and I'm lucky because I can use my job just as a way to farm information and to feed my surveys. So we looked at people, that are looking at OpenStack as a potential thing, for their environment, whether it's public, private, however they're going to consume it. This is the distribution, and sorry, it's a bit of an eye chart from the distance, but ultimately it shows you that there's a distribution across every kind of organization, every kind of organizational role. What's really cool is you take a look at the role percentage, 41% in the technology operations. So these are real people in the data centers that are running or looking to run OpenStack. So this is something that it needs to be something that we need to look at, because if this is happening, then we have to think that over the course of the next 12 months, out of the respondents that answered, it was like 40+% were going to look at OpenStack within the next 12 months. I took the same survey 2 years ago. It certainly wasn't in the 40% range. So what's important, though, is OpenStack for enterprise. Because, oh, yes, sir.
I saw a survey, it was about a year ago, and it said that in terms of OpenStack, in true production reality, there were only 750 companies worldwide, or 750, I won't call it instances, of OpenStack in production. They said the reason for that is it is so complicated to keep up once you are into it, like people
right.
get it, that only these companies could afford to gather up all the required hardcore Linux skills, etc. And they were then creating this vacuum outside of that, because only they had the money to bring the people in to run it. So they were talking about the Fords, the Boeings, Rackspaces.
Right.
Which then meant other people who could be second-tier users couldn't afford those skills in the open marketplace to then run OpenStack.
Exactly.
Comment on that?
Yeah, so this is, and
because it relates to this.
absolutely.
45% coming from.
Yeah, there is still validity to that statement. There's still a lot of organizations that aren't ready to operate OpenStack. Installing it's one thing, it's day one. Then you ever hear about day two? Day two is an interesting thing, because day two means you've got to, it's installed. Congratulations. I remember I used to have a Twitter photo, and it was somebody, and they said, the most difficult installation experience I've ever had in my life. Thank you, OpenStack. And it just shows the Horizon login screen. Like, I made it. I'm like, all right, congratulations. Now what? Now you've got it up, but how are you going to continue to operate it and grow it? Luckily, we've got a lot of interesting innovation that's happened where more packaged distributions are going to come in, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it's absolutely true that there were huge challenges, and there still continue to be challenges on being able to get OpenStack up and running, because first of all, getting it up and then continuing to run it and then to upgrade it. There was no upgrade path for most of the projects within OpenStack. You simply had to lift and shift your workloads across over onto these new platforms, and sometimes you couldn't even upgrade it in place or migrate through. So you had to basically tear down hunks of your infrastructure and re-spin it up onto new nodes. It was a real challenge. It's one that I face all the time. We visit with a lot of our customers that are using OpenStack through VMTurbo, and it's funny because everyone is like a unique snowflake. You're like, all right, perfect. You go into a VMware environment and it's like, just download, run, I'll talk to you in 20 minutes when it's ready to go. Every OpenStack installation is like, okay, I'll make sure I got some engineers set aside so we can walk through it. There are definite challenges with it. And this is why the enterprise, and so this is definitely, I don't know if you guys do Star Trek over here, it's my North American references. within the organizations of large enterprises and medium enterprises, and that's more important too. We talk about the LinkedIns and the PayPals, and I tend to not include them because we talk about true organizations that we walk into and that we meet with all the time. It's a lot different. But open source is not really new, and OpenStack is now 5 years old, almost 5.5 years old, so it's not new. So enterprise adoption of new technologies and open source technologies is not new. So the question is, why is it that we still talk about it as new in the context of an enterprise? And that's because, for enterprises, OpenStack as a concept is new because it's not packaged as well, and so we have these concerns where there's less implementations. Now on the numbers, I forget what it is, but it was around 700 that were production implementations. There's much more now, and you can see there's actually an OpenStack super user community, which is cool. I think it's just, if you just do super user or OpenStack, Google that out or go to the openstack.org, and you can take a look, and there's other companies out there, and it shows you the size of the companies. They've got a lot of references, and people are very open about sharing their story, and they can talk about it. And the cool thing is here we are a year later from when a lot of that data came out, and it's a lot better. Now the reason why OpenStack is probably the most important thing. I had all sorts of presentations that were always about all this neat technical stuff on how to do it, and then the question always comes up is why? Why would we run OpenStack over anything else? So, who runs virtualized environments today? All right, good stuff. Who's running physical servers, standalone, one app per server? All right, there's a few. That's all right. Still happens. It's all good. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to call it legacy. I'm going to call it reality. It's legacy implies that it's dead and that we're going away from it. It just is part of our environment. We've accepted. So OpenStack is not going to lift out and replace your existing environment, but what it can do is it can augment your current IT portfolio. As an administrator, an architect, it could do the same thing for you in being able to be aware. You have to be as aware of why OpenStack is important and why it won't work in your business case as you understand why it will work. So we look at all the different ideas here, and it talks about being able to have standard APIs. So who uses APIs to do everything that they do every day in their data center environment today, other than Ricky? Other than Josh. All right, we got a couple of obviously folks that are real forward-leaning in a lot of things they do. The truth is that you don't consume the API directly, but we hear about APIs all the time, right? It's critically important that the product you run has a RESTful API. Why? Not because you're going to sit there and hack away using curl to get information out of it, but because the products you buy are going to integrate with that ecosystem via the API. Loosely coupled systems means that it's safe. We can upgrade without risk. Rigid environments. If anybody 2 years ago ran vSphere and they ran Horizon and they ran vCloud, well, you got all this great news at VMworld. You're like, yay, we've got a new version available. Don't run it if you're running vCloud, and don't run it if you're running Horizon. So then they're like, okay, good, we fixed the Horizon problem. Like, okay, good, we can upgrade vCloud. Oof, oh, don't touch the vCloud environment because it's not ready because they were all tightly coupled environment. Everything was linked through direct code, SDKs only, and there was rigidity between those environments. By creating loosely coupled environments that work through an API, it meant that you can change the underlying code without a net effect of talking to the project that it's working with outside of that. So it was good because it creates flexibility to be able to upgrade in place in different parts of the ecosystem without being tied to this issue. We can support legacy, I'll use the word there, legacy APIs. You can have a version 1 API, a version 2 API, version 3 API. So if you're running, everything's coded to a version 1 API, you'll still run it for a while. They slowly deprecate it, but it means you're not going to be locked in where next year they're like, hey, we got a new version of something, and the old one's no good anymore. There's a very slow deprecation, and it's nice. The open source communities tend to work out of traditional web sort of oriented architectures, and they always were good about cleanly deprecating things. So if we want to be able to think about OpenStack and think enterprise but act OpenStack, then we have to think about what it is that we want to do. Another thing, the OpenStack advocates will tell you that you shouldn't think about high availability. It doesn't matter, right? Who's heard the phrase pets versus cattle? So this is a famous one that's been used. Randy Bias is the origin of it, although there's many others that are accredited to it. And he talked about OpenStack and cloud environments, it's treated as pets versus cattle. So we have pets. I have a virtual machine and it's named Bessie. I've got one that's called Peter. I have one called Andromeda. I've named them. I know exactly what they do. I know what applications they run. I know what IP addresses they're on. We know every one. We pet it. We take care of it. We make sure it goes to bed at night. We do all the good things to it. But the idea with web-scale application architectures and these sort of cloud-native apps is that they're meant to be cattle. VM01, VM02, VM03, SQL01, SQL02, SQL03. I don't care if they just disappear. Shoot it. Good. Because it's web scale. It's meant to be spanned across multiple environments. So the redundancy was built up at the application layer. Let's go back to the enterprise. Who here is running cloud-native applications in their data center today? Whew, 0, or close to 0. That's the reality. You're looking at architectures that aren't really meant to run in an OpenStack traditional platform. You couldn't even live migrate environments 2 years ago. You can do that now. And why? Counter to the argument that you should be able to create nothing but cattle, hyperscale, web scale style of architectures. The reality is enterprises need traditional architectures to be supported on these types of open source environments. So that's what we're running. I don't even know why it does that. It's pretty cool. So another thing was federation between the clouds. You could create an OpenStack environment, and then good, I'm going to buy a company, and that company's also running OpenStack. Yay! I can connect them together. No, you can't. They were completely separate cloud environments. There was no way to integrate the two, and you needed to recreate the entirety of their identity environment into the second one and then port stuff over, and it was a real gnarly process. It's still not entirely clean, but now you can federate between two Keystone environments. That was something that came in Kilo, which is now too old, and the most recent Liberty release further supported the strength of that. Upgrades and stability, that's the cool part. We think about enterprises, we need to be able to just put in the next version, run the upgrade, and have it work. It's important. And that's what was missing with OpenStack. So when we think about how they're dealing with in the OpenStack environments, every single project in the environment is starting to get more capabilities of providing high availability within it. So you didn't have these risks of your identity environment going away because it only had a single node. Your compute environment, same thing. You could span the controllers, you can span the endpoints. Everything can be spanned and run across multiple nodes. And fairly easily, whereas it was difficult before. You needed to use all sorts of third-party proxies and load balancers to get it to work. And you would just go through these seas of forums and people telling you like, oh, yeah, good luck with that. Resiliency and scalability. We're seeing reference architectures. Companies, so Josh at the back there, he works for a company called SolidFire. They did a really cool reference architecture implementation running OpenStack on SolidFire. It doesn't matter about the SolidFire part as much as it matters about the OpenStack part. How do they run OpenStack and make it work with a storage platform? What was cool is it enabled you to look at the OpenStack side, not just the storage bit. That's what companies are doing. We're running reference architectures through all sorts of vendors in order to show you how it runs today. And that's cool. We have an interesting thing around the federation. Like I said, like Keystone was created to allow it to go. And being able to use single sign-on. A lot of our applications, we're telling people, all right, make sure you run these web, native, cloud native, everything, something new, hyperscale, whatever you want to call it. Talk about these new style of applications, but yet you couldn't integrate them cleanly with your own identity platform. And then, of course, there was this problem. Upgrades. So you think about why would I want to package OpenStack? Isn't the whole idea you download it from source and you build from source? The only way to run OpenStack without having to be concerned about upgrades is to run direct from trunk and update nightly. If you do that, you'll never have a problem because it's fully tested, fully vetted. Take a guess how many companies are running their production environment with nightly code updates directly from trunk. I'll guess exactly. It's very close to 0. So much approaching, it's pretty minimal. Even companies that are severely forward-leaning, they tend not to lean that way because it's tough. You still need to be able to test. So the reason why packaging OpenStack is important is because it gave you that upgrade assurance, to know that you could put in the CD or put in the next build and then have an upgrade path to get from one place to the other. We saw a lot of cool vendors that built their entire environment around being able to do exactly that. We had Mirantis, they're the largest valuation for an open source company in history. 2 $100 million funding rounds. All they do is they package and support OpenStack. That's a pretty good sign. If you take a look in the last 18 months, every single VC-backed OpenStack distribution and support organization has been bought by an incumbent company. That's pretty cool. It tells you that packaging OpenStack is pretty darn important. So cloud scaling was bought by Cisco. Cisco Private Cloud, aka Meta Cloud, all of them have been bought. Blue Box, bought by IBM. You can see the writing on the wall. This is where it's going. And then, of course, why is that important? Because it's better integration with their own platforms. VMware integrated OpenStack. I've even had a lot of folks I've talked to who are OpenStack advocates, like they're worried when VMware got into the game and they started committing to OpenStack, people are like, oh, they're only doing it to make their stuff better. Like, no, they're committing to every project. They're doing massive pushes back into central code. When they bought Nicira, which has now ultimately become their network and security business unit and the NSX platform, they brought in a lot of open source developers, and that was part of the kit. They said, yeah, we stay doing what we do, and they fully supported that, and that's huge. It's very, very cool. So, the enterprise-friendly stuff is a couple of things. There's something called DefStack, which is being able to solidify and ensure upgradability within the core environment of OpenStack itself. There's something called RefStack, which is where people actually run environments. Like we talked about the 700 production environments, you can run RefStack, and it publishes back what components you're running today. And that's the cool thing about that, is you can take a look. So the core projects that we've got right now are compute, network, object storage, block storage, identity, and your image environment. And then this is the rest of the world. And sorry, again, this is a bit of an eye chart back there. Don't worry, you'll get the slides after if you really want them. And you can see here, it talks about maturity. It talks about adoption percentage. So I can take a look. I'm going to run Zakar, the OpenStack messaging service, a message queue service. 1% of implementations are running it today. So that gives you a sense, you're like, if I'm going to go down the road with Zakar, I'm like, I better be ready to, I'm going to be on my own for a little while with that stuff. But that's what's good. We're starting to see the actual utilization out in the field. And if you take all those packaged applications, they tend to run with most of the core services in there. And you can see, obviously, Horizon, 4 out of 5, it's the web UI. Most people are using OpenStack with the web UI, but there's a few companies that only use it via the API to integrate with other systems. So here's the classic thing, right? Why is OpenStack important? Because I get to avoid vendor lock-in. That's always the big thing. Everybody loves this idea. Well, yeah, it's like people saying that they're going to go to AWS because they want to avoid vendor lock-in. You ever tried to take a workload out of AWS and put it into Azure because you don't have lock-in? Good luck and may your God go with you, as David Allen used to say. That's the reality. We are not necessarily avoiding vendor lock-in, but in fact, we're latching onto it. But it's okay. We've been vendor locked in for a long time. That's like saying you're vendor locked into your marriage. You are. But I've got good news for you. It's awesome to actually know that you're coming home to the same lady or man every night. It's very, very cool. There's nothing wrong with it. We'd always love to think that we could, take your pick and have more than you want. But the reality is it's kind of cool. Why wouldn't you do that in your data center? Why wouldn't you want to have that trust that you know what you're walking into every day? Not such a bad thing. As the application stack becomes more important and the workloads become more portable, that's why we're seeing stuff like Photon. We're seeing containers, Docker, Rocket. We're seeing different layers where we're moving further up the stack, and we're able to make those workloads more portable, so the underlying hypervisors and the environments are a little less locked in, but they're equally important. So again, this is what's cool. I think about what VMware did with OpenStack. We had this original, and this was their charts that they started to work off of, and you can see that they're out of sync as far as the years go. The reason why NSX is there in 2012 is because it was already ready to cook. NSX was, the day it was called NSX, it was already fully integrated in OpenStack. So Dan Wendlandt, who was the project team lead for the Neutron project, it was then called Quantum. You kind of need a scorecard to keep track of OpenStack projects, I'll warn you of that. He already knew that it was going to work with Neutron because they built Neutron while they were at Nicira. So when NSX was born, it was already fully integrated. So you can see that the correlation between the projects, so we've got the traditional Horizon web portal, all the different CLI tools, all the API automation, all of these things started to align. You can see where they were going to line up in the VMware ecosystem. And the cool thing is that you just think of it in the concept of how these projects would interact, that Nova would speak with the vCenter driver, and then all the underlying infrastructure is still your vCenter and vSphere environment today. You can still consume it the same way you already are, and you run the workloads as they are. But the cool thing is you've got the API layers that are available with OpenStack on top, and you can deploy it easily. It's wizard-driven deployment with VMware integrated OpenStack. And then as we look at the longer-term view, you can obviously see like every single part of the VMware ecosystem was able to be tied in cleanly into the OpenStack projects. And this is what's cool, because you think about, as we look at the way that different products have come into the world, getting vendors that drive that adoption is important, because it's important for everybody else. Now, people always told me 2 years ago that I'm crazy about getting this. I was an early adopter with OpenStack. I was late because they'd been around for 3 years by the time I started working with it. Now it's 5 years in, and I'm still sometimes, people who deploy it today are still being called early adopters. And I like to think of the story of, so the North American auto market is traditionally run by 3 incumbents, right? They called them the big 3. Let's call it VMware, Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, whatever those kind of things are, right? The traditional, incumbents. And what happens is that all of a sudden out came this neat little thing called OpenStack. Toyota came around and they were this neat little upstart. And no one really thought about what it is that they were doing. Have you ever read the Phoenix Project or the Goal or any of the idea about lean manufacturing, agile, software development? A lot of it was born out of Toyota. The manufacturing processes that they've created have created an entire ecosystem that has started to touch software. It's very, very cool. So what ended up happening is all of a sudden the big 3 were no longer the big 3. Because the big 3 are American, they got pissed off because they wouldn't want to be the big 3, so they called it the big 4, so they wouldn't have to kick one out. That's what ended up happening. So all of a sudden we had this issue of this new little upstart came in. So as we, relied on the survivability of our existing skills, along comes OpenStack. And next thing you know, it's going to be in a data center that you walk into. So that's why it's important that you kind of get a sense of it. We used to run data centers this way. And we used to wear skinny ties and knit sweaters and wear pork pie hats. The funny thing is, if you walk through London, you're going to see guys with skinny ties and knit sweaters and pork pie hats. It's new and hip again. So the cool thing is that these were IBM mainframes. They're still running today. They didn't get replaced by what we did. They just augmented it. They put new systems on top of it to help us consume it better. That's what OpenStack is going to do for you. You're not going to lift and shift everything out and run it on OpenStack. You're going to run it as part of your IT portfolio. So add it to your skill set. This idea of the everything as a service model. Everything that we do should be able to be consumed as a service. It should be able to be accessible via the API. It allows us to orchestrate cleanly. Clean deprecation of APIs means that you can let it last longer. So you're going to see more and more integration with like VC Orchestrator, VRA, all these different products. Every single thing that's in the open source environment, same thing. It's meant to consume an API, and it's good that way. Adaptation is necessary. We used to have this idea where you get told like, this is what I need. And well, let's just think about what the actual reason is that you do what you do. So we're getting more and more sort of data-driven approaches to how we run our infrastructure. That's why the OpenStack project's committed to saying that let's show the adoption rate, because we wanted to actually see it, is it really used that way? When you have transparency, it's interesting when you actually open the doors. And then this became the classic thing where everybody said, okay, well look, notable, Fortune 100 enterprises are running. BMW, Disney, Walmart, obviously. They've proven that OpenStack is a full production environment. PayPal's running it, LinkedIn. That's obviously a big thing, because then everybody says, oh, no, I'm not Walmart and I'm not eBay. So why should I worry about OpenStack? Here's the reality. The bank you bank with today has more developers than your hypervisor vendor. That's a statement that is scary. Your company that you think is a brick and mortar company that keeps your money safe is a development shop. They are running OpenStack because they need to be able to consume IT resources in a new way. They need the cloud. They need it inside their data center. That's the important thing. So we take a look, as JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, large companies, they have literally tens of thousands or at least thousands of developers. And that's because they're a software company. So when you walk into that organization as a consultant, as an architect, as a sysadmin, whatever you're going to be, you need to be ready to walk into a software-friendly environment. Developers drove the need for OpenStack. They drove the need for the cloud. Shadow IT didn't happen because a sysadmin, wanted to have more hardware. It happened because development and business drove the need for that to happen. So, OpenStack is going to do the same thing for you, and think about the ways that you can consume it. If you're running vSphere, who's running vSphere Enterprise Plus or higher licensing? All right, you can download VO, the VMware Integrated OpenStack, and run it for free. It's pretty cool. You can download Mirantis Fuel, their deployment, for free. You can download Rackspace Private Cloud and deploy it for free. Free kittens, right? You got to feed them. But we take a look at what happens 2 years ago, last year, when we talked about 700 implementations, and or whatever the number was. Now, it's not thousands, but I can tell you at 5 years old, VMware had introduced vSphere 2.5. Who'd have told you at 5 years old in a VMware environment, if you were running it, and then someone would say that they're going to have over 100,000 customers, and they would be the de facto standard for virtualization in 5 more years. You'd be like, well, I don't know if this virtualization thing's going to really take off like that. In 5 years, we're going to say the same thing about private cloud. So the question is, are you going to be looking back going, I wish I'd kind of done a little more? At the very least, just understand why it's important. There's tons of resources out there. Take a look. Revelo Systems is a name you're going to see a lot. I almost feel like I should get paid by them because I want to sell their software all the time. Revelo Systems allows you to run nested lab implementations on cloud resources. You can spin up a lab environment, tear it down. You only pay for the time you use. If you're a vExpert, you actually get 1,000 hours of free cloud time per month, which is pretty badass. It's better than you used to get from AOL on those goofy CDs. So there's lots of resources. You can spin up an OpenStack platform in seconds, well, minutes, but that's still not bad, And then you can run it, test it out, see how it looks, and then think about, how am I going to do this at home? You can run it. There's lots of resources. So I run Vagrant and VirtualBox on my laptop. I have a 5-node OpenStack lab running right now. I've got a 5-node vSphere environment running right beside it. I mean, it heats up pretty good when you run both of them at the same time. But the reality is they're connected together. All of these resources are available. When VMware was 5 years old, you didn't have the opportunity to run it in your laptop. You can do it today. So, again, reach out to me. My name is Eric Wright, Disco Posse on Twitter. You can email me. I'm eric@discoposse.com, and I'm happy to help you to find resources to start your learning journey with OpenStack, do a little bit more. I'll be in and around here, and always happy to chat more. So hopefully this has been helpful, and thank you very much for supporting the VMUG.